Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Science, a diverse and wide-ranging field, is one that is often underappreciated. When we think about our planet, climate change, and whether there is life beyond Earth, we open the door to important conversations. What makes us human, and where is our place in this massive universe? Cosmos Possible Worlds is the most recent book installment of the Cosmos series. It is also a new TV series premiering September 2020 on Fox. Today, we are very fortunate to get to speak with the person responsible for this masterful work. Ann Druyan is an Emmy and Peabody award-winning American writer, producer, and director specializing in the communication of science. She co-wrote the 1980 PBS documentary series Cosmos, hosted by Carl Sagan, whom she married in 1981. Ann, thanks for joining us.
I'm really glad to be with you, Justin.
And of course, we couldn't begin this critical conversation on science and the cosmos without
TrueChat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
As many of our longtime listeners know, science nor space are one of my favorite topics, but I thoroughly enjoyed this book and look forward to the discussion we're going to have today. So I hope everybody stays tuned and learns from this wonderful author the same as I did.
And your book covers a plethora of topics, and we could easily spend numerous episodes discussing all of it. In fact, our conversation with Ann will span 2 episodes. But why do you write this new installation of Cosmos? Who is it for? And what do you hope people will gain by reading it?
I was primarily moved to write the book by the problems that we're facing and by that long shadow that hangs over our future and that of our children and our grandchildren. I wanted to do something that would awaken and inspire, and I wanted to present the power of the scientific perspective to solve these kinds of problems, and also the great potential that we hold, the ability that we have, because we've had our backs to the wall for eons before, many different times. I wanted to tell those stories of how our ancestors, with tremendous courage, resolution, and intelligence, managed to survive all of the things that were thrown at them. And so I wanted to present the solutions that we can find through science. And if we stop pretending it's not happening and face it squarely. And so, the current pandemic, it made that feeling even that much stronger. That sense that, you can fire the scientists in the government agencies who have the courage to report their findings about climate change honestly. You can take your magic marker and mark up the weather maps to suit you. You can spread unscientific information. But when there's a global pandemic, who are you going to call? That's the question. And so this Cosmos felt even more urgent than the other 2 that I've worked on over the last 40 years.
One of the things, Ann, that I think is so wonderful about your book is that there's this opportunity for people from all different backgrounds to get something out of it, because whether you come from a more scientific background or a professional background or you don't, you do a nice job of providing a way for everybody to relate to it and understand their importance.
And Ann, I'm one of those people that Justin was talking about, and I thoroughly enjoyed the book. And my first question is, we spend a good bit of time on this program making issues real for people and explaining why they should care about certain issues. In your book, you share the concept of Earth as a living organism. You point out that it's not just a nice sentiment, but it's a scientific fact. What makes this true, and how can understanding this reality help us appreciate our planet?
Well, for me, it's true on so many different levels. And, that pale blue dot image that NASA's Voyager 1 took at Carl Sagan's behest, that says it all, because that's really our true circumstances in the universe, tiny pale blue dot. And then when you start looking at it through the lens of the various scientific fields, you realize how indivisible it is. Climate, atmosphere, water, the oceans, geology, all of those things are far more influential than, the momentary phases of our failed social organization. They are real. And, it's not okay for one country to be a massive polluter, a massive lofter of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, because we are affecting people all over the world. And one of the stories in the book that I tell is how a volcanic explosion in Latin America hundreds of years ago plunged the people of Russia into a frigid famine. Now, at that time, probably no one knew. No one put these two events together. But in fact, it's well documented now scientifically. So we are one little planet, and we have to start recognizing that and behaving accordingly.
Sometimes people have this image of scientists maybe as not terribly optimistic. And I think that in a lot of ways that can be unfounded. And I very much appreciate that your book, while laying out the many challenges that we as a society face, also maintains a relatively positive and upbeat outlook. Science is kind of one of these areas that doesn't always get the attention it deserves. I mentioned that in the opening of today's program. Throughout history, many scientists have stuck to their principles, and sometimes it has cost them their lives. Vavilov's seed vault and the scientists that died protecting it are responsible for much of what we get to eat today. Ann, would you tell us this stunning story of resolve?
Nikolai Vavilov was a Russian botanist at the turn of the 20th century, in the early 20th century. And he was part of the fledgling field of genetics. And it was his dream, the thing that motivated everything he did in his life, that he would live to see a time when no one went hungry. And his idea was that he would use this new field of genetics to design food crops that could feed everyone. And so he traveled to 5 continents, going places where no scientists had ever been before, and collecting the mother plants of all the agricultural crops of the world, and trying to find genetically how these plant forebears became the plants they are today, and how they could become even more efficient. And it was his misfortune to live at a time when Joseph Stalin came to power. And even more disastrous was the fact that Stalin raised up a pseudoscientist, a person who really didn't know any science, named Trofim Lysenko. And Lysenko, just like the magic beans in a fairy tale, convinced Stalin that Russia, victimized so frequently over the centuries by extreme famine, could have a winter wheat crop. And all you had to do was soak the magic wheat seeds in ice water. Well, of course, there was no basis in science for this, but as with so many of us, Stalin jumped at it because it was what he wanted to believe. And so the price for this was the destruction of Vavilov, who would not ever, be willing to lie about science. And as his friends were rounded up and sent to prisons and heard from no more, as people lived in constant terror that they would be persecuted, it was Vavilov who stood up publicly in front of Lysenko at a great public meeting, and he said, "You can take me to the stake, you can set me on fire, but you can't make me lie about science."
And Ann, everybody needs to realize he was saying that in Stalinist Russia. And for those of our listeners who don't understand, those weren't just words, but that was almost a truism, a reality where they would burn him at the stake and take him out and end his life. And if I remember correctly, even his fellow scientists said, "Oh, we need to get you out of the country. And do you realize what you've done?" And he said, "Yes, I have." So can you please finish that and talk about how he actually was standing up and putting his very life at risk to stand up for science?
Everyone in this auditorium knew that this was a form of suicide. And within not too long a period of time, he was arrested. He was accused of treason, of being a spy, even though he had personally founded 400 different scientific institutions in what was then the Soviet Union. He was a very loyal citizen, but he could not accept, couldn't submit to this tyranny. And so he was tortured, he was imprisoned. Meanwhile, his colleagues at his institute, the Central Institute that he'd founded, which was the largest collection of varieties of seeds in the world. There had never been such a thing as a seed bank before Vavilov. And his botanists, his colleagues, not knowing if he was dead or alive, they continued to work to classify these precious seeds and to protect them, even though they were living through the most brutal siege in the history of the world. Leningrad was completely surrounded by the Germans. This was the Second World War. And people, I think 800,000 people, starved to death over this 3-year period. Those botanists, they were so steadfast. They protected the seed bank because they believed that there would be a time when the world returned to its senses. And in that time, these precious seeds, 400,000 different kinds of seeds, that these seeds would form the basis for a healthy new world. And they were very right in that regard. But they starved to death, protecting those seeds. They perished. And to me, this is one of the great stories for human self-esteem, that there could be such scientific brilliance and selflessness. That's the greatness of it, is that what I love about scientists is when they disagree, they don't put each other in jail. They don't have each other arrested. They don't kill each other. And that's the ethos of science, which we need now, to be willing to stand up for the human species in our future, to be willing even to die for it, but not to be willing to take another life. That, to me, is the exemplar of what we can be.
Especially in today's world when there's so many disagreements about everything, it seems, so much controversy. You wonder if most people were faced with starvation, would they have the resolve to not eat food that was right in front of them, to stand on their principles? And would any of us stand up to torture in the face of sticking to our principles? I don't know. I mean, I'd like to think so, but incredible respect for these scientists over the years, these ones in particular that stood by that in the face of other outs. He could have easily renounced, his positions and saved his life. Or his many colleagues back at the seed vault could have easily been eating, on their reserves of all these plants that they had collected. And they didn't. We've been talking with Ann Druyan, author of Cosmos, Possible Worlds, about the integral role science plays in our everyday life. But a number of questions still remain. Is there intelligent life beyond Earth? And what is humanity's place in the universe? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
The search for intelligent life beyond Earth and humanity's place in the universe. These are big questions that involve a thorough discussion, so Ann will actually be joining us for another episode soon. But right now, we're going to get the conversation started.
And many people probably believe humans are the only, quote, intelligent, end quote, life we know. Yet, in Chapter 7 of your book, you discuss and show us how honeybees and some trees shouldn't be so quickly discounted. Why is this the case?
I really didn't understand anything about this before I began doing the research for this book and the show. And to my astonishment, I learned that honeybees have a kind of politics. Yet, I always thought of like the queen bee. It was like a monarchy. And I was so wrong. Because in fact, the honeybee society is in so many ways far more democratic than our own. For instance, honeybees hold political conventions. There's no other way to describe it. And what they do is there's always every year, there comes a time when the weather gets warm, when it's time to swarm. And so they leave about, I think, something like 10,000 bees will leave the hive. Some will remain behind, but other bees will leave the hive and swarm nearby and then dispatch scouts, maybe 50 or 100, to explore the surrounding area and to reconnoiter, to find a new home for this subgroup that's left the hive. And they'll measure the interiors of trees, the hollows of trees. The hole can't be too close to the ground because of marauding bears who might scoop up that honey. And so they have to find a place that has not only the right safe location, but also the inner dimensions have to be perfect because honeybees don't hibernate. They use their wings to maintain a temperature inside a tree. You can look at a landscape covered with snow, absolutely freezing. And yet, in one of those trees, there's a whole community of honeybees keeping things right at the perfect temperature. Anyway, the scouts go out. They return to the swarm. And this is the most astonishing thing. They begin to communicate with the other bees in the swarm in a symbolic language.
This was really, Ann, one of those parts, and Lance kind of mentioned this when he was asking the question. it just really opens your mind to better appreciating the world around us and the things that cohabitate this world with us. Because when people think of honeybees, I'm sure the first thing that comes to mind is not these bees actually have a form of like true language. And that's kind of what you go on to talk about too, where it's not only language that they have, but they use this symbolic language to essentially form a type of democracy where they make all these different decisions as a group. It's not necessarily the system that we think of with the queen making all the decisions and everybody else following. It's actually pretty integral. So tell us a little bit more about that.
It's been long thought that humans were the only masters of symbolic language on Earth, but that was disproved by a brilliant scientist named von Frisch, who actually looked at what the honeybees were doing and deciphered their symbolic language. They are dancing a message to the other bees by the way that they spin and rotate. And this waggle dance is very precise. It can indicate to the other bees the precise location of a single tree in a nearby forest. Think of how hard that would be to do. It can communicate wind speed. It can communicate the exact altitude. It's very precise, very detailed. And what's so amazing is that they have these political conventions on the swarm, and the scouts dance their argument for the location of the best new home for the hive. And it's a consensus democracy. And they can't lie because the future of the hive depends, their survival. If it's too big, if it's not in the right place, the whole swarm will die. And they can't exaggerate. They can't sell. They can't, because there are skeptical bees who go out and check the exact location of that lone tree somewhere to measure it for themselves, and then they return. And it's not until a consensus is arrived at and everyone is essentially lined up behind one bee who's given one, who's been lobbying for one particular place, and that they decide that will be their new home.
The way they have to make that life and death decision, and they have to be spot on and do it exactly so that the whole swarm can survive. And then your next bit here in chapter 7 really kind of shook me up. So can you go on and tell us a little bit about the communication between plants and trees?
Trees communicate via a vast underground network beneath our feet. It connects 90% of the world's trees and plants. It's called a mycelium. And if you see a mushroom in the woods, or several of them, that's the fruiting body of the mycelium, many inches below ground. And via the mycelium, trees send messages to each other, and they even send empathy. Because if a woodsman comes and chops down a tree, very often the surviving trees in the vicinity will send an IV drip of sugars to keep that stump alive. Now, why do they do this? There's no specific direct selective advantage in doing that. Sometimes it's even a tree of a different species. But it's possible that there is some kind of biological recognition on their part that the survival of the forest depends on each of us, just as the future of our civilization now depends on each of us humans. And so I have to say that doing the research for this book opened a whole new world for me, and not just a scientific one, but also a spiritual one, because I now feel my relationship to the bees and the trees and the plants, for me, on a far more profound level.
And there truly is a treasure of lessons in this book. And like we mentioned, there's so much more than what we could possibly cover today. But how can we use these lessons in our modern society? And how might these observations better inform our worldview? Well, that's what Lance and I are going to discuss in the next segment of today's show. And we enjoyed your book immensely and appreciate you taking some time to speak with Lance and me.
Justin, I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you for asking such great questions and for being so thoughtful.
Ann will be joining us for another episode to discuss the search for intelligent life beyond Earth and humanity's place in the universe. So be sure to keep an eye out for the next installment of this conversation. Ann Druyan is the author of Cosmos Possible Worlds, which you can purchase by visiting thestateofus.org or anywhere books are found. How can we use these lessons in our modern society, and how might these observations better inform our worldview? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Today, we had the awesome opportunity to speak with Ann Druyan. This is somebody who is an Emmy and Peabody award-winning American writer, producer, and director. She has written several books now, a number of TV series, and it was really a joy not only to read her book, but to be able to get to speak with her today. And I know that Lance and I are really excited to do another episode with her, which will be coming soon, so keep an eye out for that. Because when we look at last segment, Lance, the last segment where we talked to her about bees and trees, not that there wasn't interesting stuff in the first segment, because there was, but I agree with you. Chapter 7 may have been one of my favorite ones, The Search for Intelligent Life, in her book. And this is one of those books, I don't want to spoil too much, but I don't know how you feel, Lance, but this is one I feel really good recommending to our audience, because what I said in the first segment about I think it offers something for everybody really is key. Some chapters, there were one or two chapters where it was interesting, but it wasn't my favorite thing. You know, nothing wrong with the chapter or the writing or whatever, just wasn't of super interest to me. But there was at least half of the book where I was very, I got a lot out of it. I guess that's the way to put it. It meant a lot because I could connect with it and it mattered to me, or it opened my mind. And chapter 7, where it's like, Lance, bees have democracy, right? I mean, they have a form of it. They vote. Holy crap. This is, it's just amazing. And trees are communicating empathy because they understand the survival of the forest is important to the survival of each of them. I mean, it starts to, I think, make us better understand that we're always looking to the stars for this other intelligent life. But isn't it interesting that there's a good argument to be made for it's right here with us already, and we don't have our own house in order? Doesn't mean that we can't be looking to the stars, but maybe we need to be a little more sensitive to what's going on right here.
Even if you're not a science person, if you're like me and, biology and geology was about as far as you got, it was just because you were required to get your degree. This is really an interesting read. I mean, there are things, as you said, in every chapter, but chapter 7 with the bees, and yes, it's that whole democracy, but the language, how, as they are sent out to find the new home for the swarm, different directions, different movements of the bee sends the message to the rest of the swarm. Okay, you go 50 yards and then you take a left, and you go 20 yards and then you take a right, and then you go up. This movement means you go up 20 feet, and there you're going to find the hole. I mean, they're GPSing, right? They're doing what people type into their phones, and they're doing it naturally. Normally I might have gone after them and tried to get them out of the way, but I'm like, no, man, this guy's working on survival and trying to tell these other bees where to go so that they can stay alive. And, that whole democracy thing that really got me was they can't lie. They can't hyperbolize. they have to tell the exact truth. This is how big a dimension this is. This is where it's located because their survival. I mean, how many messages does that send for what we're going through right now on our planet, with the bees? And then trees, I mean, man, I'm constantly trimming branches and had to make a decision to cut a couple down and worried about a couple more that are close to the house. And I'm like, I almost, like yesterday, I apologized. I said, hey, sorry, Mr. Tree, but I got to take this branch down because you're rubbing up against the house. And, I really don't like to cut off this arm, but I've got to, dude, because it really did make it realize how interconnected we are and how we are not the only air quotes intelligent species on the planet and how we've all gotten to this point, and how we depend on them for our survival. We didn't even get into that with her, but how the way we treat these other specimens, and not that some of them aren't, we have to deal with them and get rid of, but they're all here for a reason. And they're all doing something. And if you get rid of them, then you might cause a problem with another species. Just because you get rid of this one that's causing you a problem, well, it may be taking care of something else that you're not dealing with. That interconnectedness, I think, is the word that I would use between all of us and how it's always been here. To tease a little bit about that cosmic calendar in the next segment, it's always been that way. This isn't something new. We're just now being smart enough to figure it all out. I mean, there's a lot there in that answer, but it's just like, it was mind blowing. And for somebody who's not ever been interested in science. I mean, I can tell you since elementary school, that was like, stick a finger down my throat. We're doing science. But this book just really opened up my mind and was very interesting.
I hope that Ann feels good about you and I saying that. I mean, I've had an interest in, the cosmos, right, for a while. I mean, I watched, so to my knowledge, there are now 3 TV series based around Cosmos. There's the original PBS series just called Cosmos. Then there was more recently Cosmos: A Space-Time Odyssey, which I watched all of. And now there is the forthcoming Cosmos: Possible Worlds, which is both a book and is going to be a TV series, which comes out September of 2020 on Fox. So to me, Lance, that's what's great about this. Is the whole point of this is if you like science, you can enjoy it. But if you don't, it brings you into it in a way that I think broadens your appreciation for why somebody, would be willing to go through torture to stand up for what they know is right versus what people are saying and it's wrong. I mean, that whole, the Russia example, and she talked about other people too. It's not to make it sound like that's the only one, but that's literally those scientists at that seed vault who chose not to eat, all these specimens they had. I mean, that's not just a testament to them standing on their principles. She points out and, doesn't have a lot of time to expand on it, but that is one of those things. It's the reason that we have so much of what you and I eat today is thanks to this small group of people who said, I'm starving and I'm going to die, but I am not going to eat this stuff because I know that its future importance is far greater than my single life is right now. And that's just it. I think you can't read this book and not feel hopeful, because even though these examples are few and far between, the fact that they exist and that people were able to do that, I think is really inspiring. And that's part of why I like the book so much, is because you could easily write a lot of this and take it there's a lot wrong with society type of approach. And I don't think Ann hides any of that. I mean, I don't think that there's an attempt to sugarcoat it. I think it's just the way it's written and what we talk about, or what she talks about in the book, really, it makes you hopeful because it's fascinating to learn about all of it.
Yeah. And the plants are, the seeds they're around because of the diversity, right? Diversity is important because that way we can be resistant to diseases. And, and that's kind of a code word today, but diversity is huge in our survival. in plants and animals and us as a species and everything. And that shows that. And, you said it had a chapter or two. I don't know which ones it were, because every chapter I read, I was enthralled and learned something. And so much so that as I was reading, I kept thinking, I've got to get to the library when it reopens so that I can pick up the original Cosmos. And so here's me wanting to give up one of my minutes of reading, some of my minutes of reading to Blue. So here's me willing to give up my valuable reading time and wanting to read another science book. That's how much this one really connected with me. And I can't wait. And I'm going to go back. I almost felt like, oh man, because I'm so lineal. I wanted to read the first Cosmos and then read this one, but I'm willing to go back and read the first one anyway, because this one had that much of an impact on me. So I really enjoyed our discussion, and there's lots coming up in our next episode. So people need to, because we're not done yet. I mean, there's some really cool stuff. I mean, we haven't asked the big question, right? And that is, we're talking about other intelligent life on Earth, but is there intelligent life out there in the cosmos that we either have or have not come in contact with yet? Have they made contact with us and we don't know?
Well, and the implications of that. That's part of what we're going to talk about in the next episode too. It's not just, we've all wondered, right, for a long time. And we even know a lot of people feel like, well, there's got to be, right? There's got to be life out there. But there's some questions that spring off of that we're going to look into next time, including, well, if there is life out there, what do we do about that? And if there isn't, what do we do about that? And we're going to be able to ask Ann those questions. So if those have some interest to you, again, Lance and I definitely recommend this book. Take time to pick it up. It is worth the money. And it's in collaboration with National Geographic. That's who published it. So we didn't even get to talk about that, but there's a lot of great pictures and graphics that are supplemented in the book. And I think those help. For me, they do. I'm visual. And so you get to read that and see some of the graphics. And it's just a really, really well done. Not that we expect anything less from our friends at National Geographic. Yes, high quality. And so, Lance, this whole conversation we've been having today, right, speaks to our mission at True Chat, because talking about things like this, opening people's minds, that's a big part of what we're about.
It is. And, our mission here at True Chat is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And, Justin, they can find us a lot of different ways, and they need to get the word out, because the mission statement doesn't do any good if other people don't hear it, if we're not reaching that audience. And so you need to help us and tell your friends that if they're into podcasts or they're a new podcast listener, that they can find us on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and anywhere else fine podcasts are found, and spread the word.
Again, special thanks to Ann for taking time to be on today. We really enjoyed it, and she's going to be on for another episode, so be sure to keep an eye out for that. For the State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our producer, Bradley Butch, for getting all this together, and thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.